Welcome back to the Biochemistry for Health Sciences channel. In today's video, we shall present an overview of proteins in the human body. Hello, this is Professor, and I'm glad to say that my assistant, Cooley, is back to help me with these videos. Yes, Cooley, this is very true. Understanding proteins is very important for healthcare. Remember, one of the major objectives for these videos is to connect biochemistry with medicine, basically molecules to medicine. And this is what we shall be doing step by step in future videos. And so one of the most important molecules which we shall see is proteins. So understanding the connections of proteins with medicine is very essential for the healthcare student as well as the healthcare professional. So looks like Cooley got a lot of pictures as well as videos from his travel, and he would like to share some of this with you. So here is Cooley starting his trip, his hiking trip in Florida, and he sees this pair of sandhill cranes. They look like sandhill cranes preparing a nest for their babies or baby. Looks like he has a few pictures as well as videos which will tell you the story about these pair of sandhill cranes and the birth of their baby. That'll be very exciting to see. So here's a video of the pair of sandhill cranes working very, very hard to prepare their nest. Very nice video, Cooley. Hard-working cranes getting ready to have their baby. I kind of like the duck at the end that was swimming and suddenly disappeared. Okay, so about proteins. There are several protein tests that form part of the comprehensive metabolic panel. These are routine tests, and you can see in this list here is an example of one of these panels that is typically done or ordered by physicians and clinicians. And you can see there are many proteins here. Alkaline phosphatase, for example, is an enzyme. Albumin is a protein found in the bloodstream that has many functions. This is total proteins in the blood. We'll talk about all this in future videos. ALT is an enzyme. AST is also an enzyme. And there is this albumin-globulin ratio. So albumin is one of the blood proteins, and globulin is a mixture of blood proteins that we'll talk about in future videos. So besides the routine protein tests, there are also a lot of specialized protein tests that are sometimes ordered by clinicians to monitor or diagnose disease. Here's just a few examples. There are many protein tests that are being used by the clinicians. So we will discuss them at appropriate times in future videos. So here, for example, is troponin, a very important test for myocardial infarction. So this is a protein, specific protein that is found in heart muscle. And then there is CKMB, which is an enzyme. By the way, troponin is not an enzyme, although sometimes you see that being said it's an enzyme. That's not true. Troponin is just a cardiac marker. It's not an enzyme. But CKMB and creatine kinase, these are enzymes. These were traditionally done for myocardial infarction, but now these tests have been replaced by troponin. And then there is other kinds of protein specialized tests. Well, here's another example, BNP, or brain natriuretic peptide. Okay, so many tests for proteins that we'll talk about in future videos. So this is a slide to show you the big picture about proteins. So we begin with DNA in the nucleus, your chromosomes. They have the protein coding genes, and that protein coding gene is transcribed or copied, what we call RNA synthesis, into messenger RNA. So for example, T here is copied to A into U, C into G, and so on. And then this mRNA, together with all the other RNAs, ribosomal RNA, transfer RNA, and what we call the other RNA or regulatory RNA, they have their own genes, and these are all copied. Then this RNA undergoes processing. So for example, your mRNA, in your mRNA, the intron, this part here, is removed, and then these two exons are connected to form this spliced mRNA. And then there are other processing events like addition of a cap at one end and then the addition of a tail at the other end. So there are several processing steps that happen to these various forms of RNA. And then eventually these RNAs are exported out into the cytoplasm. The ribosomal RNA together with proteins form the ribosome. The transfer RNA will be attached to specific amino acids, and the mRNA will then be read. So this information here, AUG here, specifies according to the genetic code the amino acid methionine. UUU here specifies phenylalanine. CCC specifies according to the genetic code proline, and so on. And once the UAA message, which is a stop codon, is read, protein synthesis stops. The protein is released. This protein is released, and this protein starts folding. And the protein may also undergo further processing, and eventually the folded and processed protein is transported to the right location in the cell. So for example, if this protein was insulin, so insulin is stored in the beta cell of the pancreas, and at appropriate times it will be secreted out of the cell by exocytosis. So it depends on the function of the protein. It's located where it carries out its function. It might go to the nucleus, it might stay in the cytoplasm, it might stay get embedded in the plasma membrane, and so on. So all of these proteins that are made by the cell is what we call the protein profile of the cell. Protein profile of a cell. And most of these proteins, they carry out some very important functions for the cell, which we shall talk about this in a few seconds. So that's basically what's happening in the 200 different types of cells. They all have their protein profiles and they're all doing something together, working with one another to give us our anatomy and physiology. And if anything goes wrong in any of these steps here, you can clearly see there may be problems with the anatomy and physiology, and that will lead to pathology or disease. Okay, so this is the sort of a big picture of the importance of proteins in the human body. So what do proteins do? Well, first of all, I think it would be very appropriate if we classified proteins into different categories. So in this video, we are going to classify proteins into 7 categories. So there are 7 types of proteins that we'll talk about. So let's start with the first type, and that is nucleic acid binding proteins. So as the name suggests, these proteins bind nucleic acids. They bind DNA and or RNA. So examples of these proteins are transcription factors, which affect gene regulation. There are many different transcription factors. Here are a few examples. Then we have steroid as well as vitamin D receptors as well as thyroid receptors. These are also proteins that will bind nucleic acids and they affect gene expression. And then we have examples, another example, high mobility group or HMG proteins that also affect gene regulation by binding nucleic acids. And then there are several proteins involved in DNA replication, which bind nucleic acids. Examples we'll talk about in the future under DNA replication or DNA synthesis is cyclins and single-stranded binding protein or SSB. Another type of nucleic acid binding protein are the proteins that repair DNA in case the DNA is damaged. Okay, several examples of this, mRNA, nucleotide excision repair proteins, and red proteins. Okay, so this category of proteins that we call nucleic acid binding proteins, they have special shapes that can actually bind DNA and or RNA to carry out their functions. The second category of proteins are the enzymes. Enzymes are catalysts. That means they increase the speed or the rate of biochemical reactions. So enzymes are present everywhere in the body. Here are a few examples. We have enzymes in the digestive system. For example, pepsin secreted by the chief cell in the stomach. The pancreatic acinar cells secrete amylase, lipase, phospholipase, enzymes that break proteins down called proteases, and then enzymes that break nucleic acids down called nucleases. And then the small intestinal enterocyte cells have enzymes on their membranes, enzymes such as lactase, maltase, and sucrase. And all of these enzymes help in digesting our food, so we can call them digestive enzymes. The bloodstream is filled with enzymes. Many examples of clotting enzymes that allow blood to clot, as well as anti-clotting enzymes that prevent blood clotting. Cells, all the 30 trillion cells in a human adult, all of these cells have a variety of metabolic enzymes. Okay, enzymes involved in metabolism. The third category of proteins are the signal transduction proteins. So these are proteins that help cells respond to their changing environment appropriately. Signal transduction proteins. In the signal transduction proteins, we shall also include signals that are proteins, protein signals. There are many signals that are proteins. So for example, your protein hormones such as your insulin, your glucagon, gastrin, erythropoietin, the hormones from the hypothalamus, the hormones from the pituitary gland. Okay, so all the protein signals, we shall categorize them under signal transduction proteins. Then the signals bind receptors. These receptors are also signal transduction proteins. Example, the insulin receptor that binds insulin and the glucagon receptor that binds glucagon. Then we have other kinds of signal transduction proteins such as adapter proteins, SOS, PRB. All of these help in signal transduction. The other important types of protein signals include, examples include growth factors. These are proteins that stimulate cell division as well as differentiation, cellular differentiation. For example, VEGF or vascular endothelial growth factor is a protein signal that stimulates the growth of blood vessels, angiogenesis, okay, the growth of blood vessels. And then we have protein signals such as cytokines, interleukins, tumor necrosis factor, and many, many more examples. And these are proteins that are involved in signal transduction, which are secreted mostly by the immune cells, although many other cells are also involved in their synthesis as well as secretion. So the fourth type of protein class is the transport proteins. As their name suggests, they are involved in a very important cellular activity, which is transport. So examples are transporters such as the glucose transporter. We'll talk about this a lot in metabolism, the GLUT1, GLUT2, and so on. Then we have protein transporters for amino acids, and then we have protein transporters for water, the aquaporins. So all of these proteins help transport organic or inorganic chemicals across membranes in a cell. Then we have motor proteins such as myosin 1 and myosin 5 that are involved in transporting chemicals in the cell. We have membrane trafficking proteins that are involved in exocytosis or endocytosis to bring in chemicals into the cell or to excrete chemicals or remove or secrete chemicals out of the cells. And examples of these membrane trafficking proteins, which we'll talk about in the future, COP2, SIR1, VSNA, and so on. And then we have the very important ion channels and pumps. For example, the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump, which is on cellular plasma membranes that pump sodium out of the cell and bring potassium into the cell. Okay, so many of these types of transport proteins, potassium channels, calcium channels, chloride channels, and so on. All of this we shall talk about at appropriate times in future videos. So we also have proteins that transport chemicals in the bloodstream. So for example, transferrin is a protein that transports iron. Ceruloplasmin is a protein in the bloodstream that carries copper. Albumin is a blood protein that carries all kinds of organic chemicals, fatty acids, bilirubin, and so on. Hemoglobin, found in red blood cells, carries oxygen. The apoproteins or the apolipoproteins involved in transport of lipids. So many transport proteins in the bloodstream besides in the cells. The fifth category of proteins are the defense proteins. So examples of defense proteins, of course, are the antibodies, the immunoglobulins, such as IgG, IgM, and so on. And then we have this variety of complement proteins that helps our body to fight off infections. And of course, let us not forget these very important mucous proteins that are secreted by the epithelial cells that line our body cavities. So these play a very important role in protecting our body cavities, such as our digestive system, the urinogenital system, as well as the respiratory system. So we shall talk about these proteins at appropriate times in future videos. The sixth category of proteins we have in our body are the structural proteins. So the structural proteins include cytoskeletal proteins, cell adhesion proteins, as well as connective tissue proteins. The cytoskeletal proteins include the microfilaments, which is made up of the protein G-actin, and these microfilaments are involved in formation of microvilli, changing shapes for migratory cells. They serve as intracellular highways. They are also involved in muscle contraction. Another type of cytoskeletal protein is the intermediate filaments, examples cytokeratins, peripherin, vimentin, desmin, and so on. And these intermediate filaments provide mechanical strength to the cell and its organelles. Microtubules is another type of cytoskeletal protein made up of tubulin, and these are involved in intracellular transport as well as cell movement and mitosis. The cell adhesion proteins, one of their major functions is to attach cells to one another. So these are called cell-cell junction proteins, example claudins, cadherins, lectins, VCAM, ICAM, NCAM, connexins, and so on. And now it is also known that these play a very important role in cell signaling also. And then we have the proteins, what we call cell extracellular matrix junction proteins. These are proteins that connect the cell to the extracellular matrix. And examples of these are integrin and BPAG. And once again, we now know that these are not just structural proteins, but they also play a very important role in signal transduction. Then we have the connective tissue proteins. These are structural proteins that provide shape and strength to tissues, and they're also involved in the storage of certain signals, important for cell division as well as for cell differentiation. Examples of connective tissue proteins are the glycoproteins. These are proteins that have attached carbohydrates. Example, collagen, laminin, fibronectin, elastin, and so on. And then we have, these are actually carbohydrates, this category here, but it's appropriate to talk about them here. So these are actually mostly carbohydrates to which is attached some proteins. So these are called proteoglycans that we discussed in an earlier video. And finally, the last category if a protein doesn't fall in any one of the other 6 categories, that is, if it's neither a nucleic acid binding protein or enzyme or signal transduction or transport or defense or structural, then we simply categorize it under a miscellaneous classification. So these are miscellaneous proteins. Examples of these are the cytochromes that we'll talk about under the electron transport chain, the major histocompatibility complex proteins or the MHC proteins that play a very important role in self-recognition. Chaperones are proteins that help other proteins fold correctly into their 3-dimensional shapes. Then we have proteins such as ubiquitin, and these proteins basically label damaged proteins for their subsequent destruction. So this is what proteins do. So basically they bind nucleic acids to regulate gene expression, which indirectly regulates the type and amount of proteins in the cell. Proteins called enzymes make biochemical reactions go faster. They are catalysts. Signal transduction proteins help cells respond appropriately to their changing environment. Transport proteins bring all kinds of chemicals into the cell and transport chemicals out of the cell or in and out of their organelles. Defense proteins basically protect us against microbes and other pathological insults. Structural proteins mostly provide structure to cells as well as their organelles and tissues, and they may also be involved in signal transduction. So this is a basic overview of the proteins that we find in our cell. You will come across many proteins in your career as a healthcare professional or student. So it might be a good idea whenever you hear of a protein to try to classify it into one of these 7 categories. So in future videos, we shall come across many different examples of proteins and their functions and what happens if that protein is missing or is defective. So this is a very important area for the healthcare professional, and that is the topic of proteins and their functions. So until the next video, goodbye and have a very good day. See you soon.